Philippians chapter 1, and we're looking at verses 12 to 20 today. So, Philippians 1, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it became known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment was for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. Throughout history, there have been many different types of warfare, and different armies see it as a different way, different strategies to have for warfare. Even if we just take World War II alone, we have the Nazis with their blitzkrieg methodology, for anyone who has studied World War II a bit, where they would come in with the bombing overhead and then the tanks would go in after. But then in the same war, we have the Soviets who had their scorched earth policy. We have the Japanese with their kamikaze methods. And these are various forms of warfare that each one saw was what would best advance their cause, what would best advance their chances of victory. And we can look at a lot of them, you can weigh them up, and a lot of them make sense for various reasons. But I wonder what you think of someone who thought that the best way to advance their cause was to have one of their leading people, one of their best men, as it were, locked up in prison. Is that a good strategy? Is that a good way to advance your cause, to take your best man and lock him up in a prison somewhere? It doesn't seem to the natural mind the smartest thing, but apparently to God it does, and that's what we're going to look at today, that strategy. And so the first thing I want to look at is Paul and his circumstances. Paul and his circumstances and what that shows us. He says in verse 12, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. What has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. And so as good students of the word, we come to that and it says, what has happened to me? And we should say, well, Paul, what has happened to you? What has happened? And we should go back and look and see, well, what was the thing that Paul is talking about here? We shouldn't just gloss over things like that, but say, well, what is it? So that we can understand what Paul is actually talking about here. Well, Paul had been he'd been on 3 different missionary journeys throughout Asia and then to Macedonia, Greece. And he'd be on 3 of these journeys, and he'd come back to Jerusalem to worship. And as he came back to Jerusalem to worship, he decided, well, I'll go up to the temple, I will show the people here who are against me that I'm not against the law. I'm not against Judaism. I'm still a Jew. I'm still one who understands that this was the way that God revealed himself, but I worship the fullness of that. But he wanted to make sure that he wasn't being mistaken for what he was saying. He wasn't going to go and be against the temple or anything like that. So he decided to go to the temple and show people that was the case. However, he goes there, and with all of these good intentions in his heart, they take him anyway. And a mob is created, and the Romans have to intervene, and he's going to be beaten by the people. So the Romans take him out of that, and then he addresses the people and causes even more of an uproar. And then the Romans are going to flog him, and they find out he's a Roman citizen. And then there's a plot for his life, and he's taken away, and he has all these false accusations put against him. He's in waiting for trial for over 2 years. And all the time there's false accusations of people who don't really care much to listen to his message. And then eventually he's being taken to Rome and into a stressful journey that's included being bitten by a snake, people trying to kill him, shipwreck, all sorts of issues. And now finally he's in Rome and he's in prison and he is languishing there. This is all that Paul has just gone through. It's not easy. But I wonder what would be our response if we were in that situation. What would be our response if we were languishing in prison after going through all that and all those false accusations and threats on our lives and everything else? What would be our response if we were languishing in prison like Paul? And maybe we won't have that joyful chance ever, but maybe we could say, well, what would other people say even now is the most important thing in your life? When you're under pressure, what comes out of you and what is shown in your life to be the most important thing to you? Because it's probably how you would feel if you were like Paul, languishing in prison. What would other people looking at your life say the most important thing is? Well, for Paul, what do we have? He says that these things that have happened, all of this hardship that I've faced, all of these false accusations, injustices, everything else, they have really served. This is the great bit of it. They really served to advance the gospel. And he goes on to tell about how the gospel has been advanced. We'll look at that in a few minutes, but he says how it's gone through all the Roman guards there. It's caused other people to be enthused about sharing the gospel. It means that in lots of different ways, Christ is being proclaimed. He's rejoicing that other people are enabled to share the gospel. He's rejoicing just that it's going out. And he doesn't care for his imprisonment because he sees that God has, through his imprisonment, through its proclamation, between Paul's proclamation alone, through enabling others, all these different ways, the gospel is going out. And so he sees his imprisonment as a vehicle, a way for God to manifest the gospel to the world. And that's what his response is in the midst of all these hardships, after these years of heartache. That's his response, which is to what a lot of us would be most of the time, I am guessing. Because often our response in things like this would be, oh, well, if we just wait until this trial is over, this period in my life is over, then I'll serve God more fully. Once he's freed me from this or that or the other, I don't have those responsibilities, or I'm not suffering in that way, then I'll be able to give my full attention to the cause. I'll really go for it then. Or maybe we'd rise up and we'd say, well, this is unjust. I'm going to fight for my rights. I'm not going to take this sitting down. I've had false accusations against me. I've had this, that, and the other, and we just complain about it and try to claim our own rights. Or maybe we just sit down and cry and just be paralyzed by the fear and the situation of it all. And I would hazard a guess, and I point the finger at myself here as well, that maybe Christians in general have dealt very badly with the trial of COVID. How often have we prayed for God to shake the world, to shake the people so that they come to realize their need for him, and then God does it? We spent most of the last 18 months complaining about how the world is, or complaining about how it's affected us, or complaining impact that it's having on our lives. And we spent more time complaining about it rather than coming along to God and saying, I rejoice that you have done this. Not I rejoice in the middle of this, so that is legitimate. But I rejoice because of this, because you're taking this, and what you have done, even though it's hard, is really serving as a vehicle for the gospel. It's really served to advance the gospel. And maybe instead of spending so much time complaining about COVID and how it's affecting us, we should take the attitude of Paul and say, well, how is this advancing the gospel? How can we advance the gospel in this situation? What is God doing here, even though it's hard, even though there's wrong things around? How is God advancing the gospel and rejoicing in that? We read of rejoicing so much in this letter. And this is Paul's greatest rejoicing in this section, is that the gospel is going forth even in the midst of his hardships. And so what do we do when we're faced with these sort of things? And so I'd say that there's two things that we need to take from this first point. And the first is that Paul saw things from God's point of view, not as a view of injustice against himself, but that God was about to do something extraordinary and was doing something extraordinary in advancing the gospel. And, you know, when we were in Birmingham on placement, it was Eid, the Muslims' festival. They have two different ones in the year. And we were going house to house, delivering gifts of sweets and a card with a gospel verse in it. And there was a lot of houses to get through, a lot of houses to visit. And of course, everyone wants to talk. It's like their Christmas. And so you come to their door and they're like, oh, come on in, or have food. And you cannot stop at every house. You have to keep moving. Sometimes you'll get quite frustrated because you want to get through this. You want to get to all the houses so that they all know of this message of the gospel, and that they're all touched by the hands of Christ that day. And you try and get through all the houses and people keep stopping you. And one person stopped us for ages, and it was quite frustrating, especially for the folks that we were working with. But as we went around the corner then to the next house, out from the driveway came a lady who had been told by her imam to cut off all contact with Christians. She'd been asking too many questions, searching too deeply, and her imam had told her to cut off all contact with Christians. So they hadn't felt it right to go to her house or anything like that. But she had, Liz, who we were working with, had taken a platter of sweets for her in faith, that we would bump into her at some point during the day. And as we came around from being held up for so long at the house before, we came around the corner and she was just right there. So even though we couldn't go searching her out or weren't able to go to her house because she had been told to cut off contact with us, we couldn't help bumping into her in the street and letting her know that the people there still cared for her, that she was still loved by Christ. Now, we could have complained about being held up at one door, or we could see that God uses these things to advance the gospel. And even hardships like being in jail, all sorts of hardships. What is our focus? Are we realizing what God is doing in advancing the gospel, or are we more concerned about how it affects us? So that's the first thing. And secondly, the gospel was so important to Paul. It was just so important to him, and we have to question how important is the gospel to us. And so that just brings me on to the second point, which is this: what is the gospel? If Paul is raving about this gospel so much and so concerned that it is to go out and so rejoicing that God is making sure this is spreading, well, what is the gospel? He mentions it twice here. He says that this has served to advance the gospel. And he says again that he is in prison for the defense of the gospel. What is it? And that might seem a strange question to ask in church, a strange question to ask Christians. But the fact is that we so often drift away from the fullness of the gospel. We so often reduce the gospel down to nothing but a list of facts, or a get out of hell free card. Now, the gospel is factual, and we do escape judgment. But according to what we're going to see here, Paul's definition of the gospel is so much more than just a list of facts or a get out of hell free card. And so firstly, the gospel is what changes lives. And we know this by who he is writing to in this situation. Who is he writing to? He's writing to the church in Philippi. Now, Paul's mentioned a bit of this last week, and I would encourage you that as we're studying this letter, keep going back to Acts chapter 16, where Paul is in Philippi, and we learn something about the church there. The church in Philippi are, the first person that Paul meets, it's a group of women. They go down, they're looking for someone to pray. They go down to the river thinking they might find some people. They find this group of women, and they sit down and talk with them. And the leading woman amongst them, Lydia, she becomes a believer. Others become believers, and she opens her house to the church to gather in. And so we have this woman who's a well-to-do business. She's a businesswoman, an influential woman in the region, but her life is changed such that she opens her house to this new way, this gospel. It changes her life. And then, of course, Paul and Silas are going through the marketplace, and there's a slave girl who's coming along behind them, and they cast the spirit out of her. Now, we don't know for certain that she was saved, but she could have been. A girl who had been used by these men, a girl who had been possessed by the devil, and all of a sudden the gospel comes into Philippi, changes her, and breaks her of those bonds, and brings her into fellowship there. Or how about the Roman jailer, a man who is committed to the emperor, who worships as many gods, who is, in charge of this jail and has a good life going for him, and then he's faced with death, and the gospel comes in and saves him and saves his family. And all these people from different walks of life who are completely and utterly transformed are brought into fellowship in one place in Philippi to rejoice together over what God has done in their lives. And so this gospel is a gospel that changes lives. These are the people that Paul is writing to. And when he mentions the gospel, what do you think welled up inside of them? When he mentions to these saints in Philippi that he's in jail in Rome and he's there because of the defense of the gospel, they go, yes, it is worthy to be defended. It is something that is worth defending because Paul had changed our lives. And as we think upon that, let us never, ever forget what it meant for the gospel to enter into our lives. We so easily forget. We so easily just get stuck into life and forget what we were before the gospel entered in. Before Christ came in and utterly changed us from what we were to something new. That we, with those saints in Philippi, are different now. We're changed because Christ has changed us so wonderfully through the gospel. And it is something that is worthy to be defended. So it is something that is life-changing, and let us never, ever forget that, like the people that Paul was writing to. But the other thing about what is the gospel is this, and this is perhaps the most important point here. The center of the gospel is not a list of facts. It's not a list of arguments as to the truthfulness or the reason why God exists or the truthfulness of scriptures or anything like that. The center of the gospel is not merely you can escape judgment if you live a certain way. The center of the gospel is Jesus Christ. If you want someone to get a message and get it drilled into their heads, just keep repeating it. Okay. Now, in this passage, Paul repeats Christ again and again and again. It's only a few verses, and yet we have his imprisonment is for Christ. They've become confident in the Lord. Some preach Christ. The former proclaim Christ. What then? I rejoice that Christ is proclaimed. The help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. That with full courage now, it's always Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. To Paul, the center thing of the gospel is Jesus Christ. He doesn't even use the words here, I rejoice merely that the gospel is preached or the gospel is proclaimed, but 3 times that either Christ is preached or Christ is proclaimed. That is what we proclaim. We don't just proclaim the gospel as this ethereal thing that we don't have something solid to it. The gospel that we proclaim is Christ. We proclaim Christ. We proclaim a person. It is him. And this is something that we so often get away from. We get stuck on just rundowns of lists of doctrines, or our 5-point gospel presentations, that we sometimes forget the one that we proclaim, a person. It is Jesus Christ. It is a person who we have come to know and come to love. And if we find that we are not as passionate about the gospel as we wish that we were, if we find that we're not as enthusiastic about the gospel as Paul is here, then maybe it's time for us to recalibrate. When I worked in the aircraft industry, we would often have to recalibrate tools. Sometimes it would be that after a period of time, they would have to be recalibrated, a year or 2 years, in order to give a true reading. Or sometimes it would be if they got a knock, if they had a hard fall, the tool would often be out of calibration, so you'd have to send it away to be calibrated again. Well, if tools need it after a hard knock or after a period of time, how much more do we? Life comes knocking on us. People come with all sorts of arguments and facts that cannot just be answered with Christian cliches all the time. And sometimes just because we have a list of facts, it doesn't always help us. And when difficulties of life come and they knock us, and they cause us to become uncalibrated, we forget and we stray away from the one who is the center of the gospel. Or over time, we again get set in set ways and we just drift slightly off course. We need to be brought back to the center of the gospel. Because in those days when difficulties come, or where hard arguments that Christian cliches can't really answer, when those things come along, facts are not going to satisfy us. Pure facts alone. Now, as I said, Christianity is a factual religion, and the facts are there. But the devil has facts. We have more than that. We have Jesus. And on those difficult days where we cannot barely lift our heads because doubt or distress grasps our heart, the one thing that we will have is Jesus. It is a person who is the center of the gospel. It is a person who has changed our lives. And that's what we want. That's what, when we were first saved, that's what we knew. We knew that it was just Jesus. And we wanted other people. We were so close to him. We loved him. We didn't know everything. We didn't know all the doctrines that we should know or anything, that we just knew that we had. And we wanted other people to know him. We didn't just want people to agree. We wanted people to know him, did we not? And it should be the same way now. And we need to recalibrate to the one who is the center of the gospel. The center, he is the one that we proclaim. And so, in conclusion, this was Paul's situation. This is how he saw it. And it was because of this gospel that had so gripped his life, that was Jesus Christ. He didn't care about the injustices against him. He didn't care about those. He wanted to advance the gospel. And he saw these things as God's vehicle for doing that. God's methodology for advancing his cause. But how do we do it? How do we join in that? How do we do that? Well, first of all, that's always how we need to love Christ and recalibrate to the center of the gospel. But also, just a couple of quick points of how we join in proclaiming Christ. Paul says that he does this in life or in death in verse 20. That Christ will be honored in my body by life or by death. To die for Christ, I think that's an easier thing than to live for Christ. You know, we could be all heroic once and say, I'm going to give my life. If someone bursts into the church now with a gun, well, I'd be safe because I'm upstairs. But the rest of you would church with a gun. Maybe you'd take your stance, I'm for Christ, and you'd lay down your life for Christ. Wonderful. And we can be heroic. People can be heroic. But what about every day? Is Christ proclaimed through our lives on a daily basis? That's a lot harder to do. But we need to resolve in our hearts that by the grace of God, we will rise every morning so that everybody about us sees the advance of the gospel, the proclamation of Jesus Christ in our lives. day by day by day. It's not a once-off thing. It's not a thing we do one day a week. It's a daily thing. Secondly, we need to bear in mind unity. If we want to be involved in proclamation of the gospel, we need to be unified in the gospel. A lot is said in Philippians about unity, so we'll touch on that again. But Paul is here rejoicing even when his enemies are preaching the gospel. How much more then should we be gracious and humble and rejoicing with other denominations and other churches, even who are like us, that when these other places, other brothers and sisters in Christ are also preaching the gospel and seeing gospel victory and gospel advance done, there needs to be unity in the gospel. So laying down our lives daily for the gospel, unity in the gospel, mobilizing other people to do it. We need to be helping other people to share the gospel as well. Paul here acknowledges that some people were afraid to share the gospel before. Fear is a natural thing. It happened in the first century. Not all Christians in the first century were these bold evangelists. They had fear, but they overcame it. Paul was working with these people, and then finally when he went into prison, they were saying, okay, I'm going to stand up for what Paul believes in now, for that gospel. I'm going to stand up and proclaim it now. And so we need to be mobilizing others and helping them past fear of sharing the gospel. It's natural, but we should be wanting to come together to help each other share the gospel. And finally, as we've already mentioned, seeing all circumstances, everything. When you've got a flat tire, when you have, when you spill your coffee on you at work, whatever it is, all circumstances, good or bad, wherever you are, as opportunities for God to advance the gospel. Why? Why? Because it changes lives. Because it's all about Christ. Let us be filled with him. And this morning as we come and we take the bread and we take the wine, let us be filled with Christ so that he may be the center of the gospel that we proclaim.